What if history is not a straight line, but a shoreline, where entire worlds rise, leave traces in the sand, and are quietly taken back by the tide? We are told this is the height of human achievement, that nothing like us has come before. Yet the earth remembers floods deeper than our myths, fires older than our calendars, silences buried beneath cities we no longer recognize as ruins. Somewhere between stone and memory, something was lost, or perhaps carefully left behind. Tonight, there is no need to resolve that tension, only to sit with it, to listen, and to follow the faint echo of civilizations that may have fallen asleep long before us, waiting to be remembered. There is a quiet assumption woven into modern thought, so familiar that it rarely announces itself. It suggests that humanity has climbed steadily upward, step by step, from crude beginnings toward complexity, awareness, and mastery. Stone to bronze, fire to engine, myth to measurement. Yet this comforting ascent begins to feel less certain when one notices the gaps, long stretches where the record grows thin, where knowledge seems to stall or even retreat, where silence presses harder than explanation. These absences are not small. They span millennia. They appear not as gentle pauses, but as ruptures, as though something vital was interrupted and never fully resumed. Deep beneath our cities lie other cities, beneath those still older foundations. Archaeologists speak carefully of the layers, of strata and sediment, of timelines stacked like pages in a book whose earliest chapters are torn away. What remains are fragments that do not quite fit the story we prefer to tell, precision-cut stone where crude tools are expected, sudden leaps in organization without a visible apprenticeship, calendrical knowledge that seems to arrive fully formed, already aligned with celestial rhythms that demand generations of observation. These are not proofs of a lost world, but they are persistent disturbances, like a low hum beneath the narrative of progress. Even the Earth itself carries memories that feel strangely out of sync with human recollection. Ice cores reveal abrupt climate shifts, not slow transitions but sudden turns, where temperature and atmosphere changed with alarming speed. Geological records whisper of massive floods, of coastlines erased, of ecosystems collapsing and reforming in spans too short for gradual adaptation. Human cultures across the globe, separated by oceans and epochs, speak in similar tones of waters rising, skies darkening, fires falling from above. These accounts are often dismissed as metaphor, as collective fear given mythic shape. And yet, when myths from distant lands begin to echo one another too closely, coincidence starts to feel like an inadequate explanation. In these moments, the idea of earlier civilizations does not arrive as a bold declaration, but as a hesitant possibility. Not necessarily advanced in the way modern technology defines advancement, but sophisticated in other directions: astronomy without telescopes, architecture without steel, social systems balanced delicately against environmental cycles. If such cultures existed, their greatest vulnerability may have been the same as ours: dependence on stability. When that stability fractured, when the climate turned, or the seas advanced, or the sky behaved in unfamiliar ways, complexity would have become a liability. Networks fail faster than villages. Knowledge concentrated in centres vanishes more completely than wisdom spread through habit and ritual. What follows collapse is not simply absence, but forgetting. Survivors adapt downward, not upward. Skills narrow, memory compresses. What was once lived becomes symbol, then story, then something told only to children before sleep. Over generations, the origin of these stories dissolves, leaving behind gods, monsters, punishments, and rebirths. A flood no longer describes water alone, but judgment. A fire from the sky becomes divine anger. The past is not denied. It is transformed, rendered unrecognizable by reverence and fear. There is another silence worth listening to, the silence of missing technologies. Organic materials decay, metals corrode, electrical systems leave almost no trace beyond disturbed soil and strange isotopic signatures that would be easy to overlook or misinterpret. If an earlier civilization built in harmony with materials that return easily to the earth, its physical legacy might be deceptively light. Stone remains because stone resists forgetting. Everything else asks to be remembered intentionally. Without continuity, memory collapses faster than monuments. Modern science is cautious here, as it must be. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, yet science also acknowledges uncertainty, especially at the edges of deep time. The further back one looks, the more probabilistic the picture becomes. Absence of evidence does not confirm presence, but neither does it guarantee absence. Between certainty and speculation lies a wide terrain of unanswered questions, and it is there that the idea of prior civilizations lingers, not as fact, but as pressure, as a reminder that the past may be more layered than linear. What unsettles many is not the possibility that civilizations rose and fell before us, but what that would imply about our own moment. If we are not unique, then neither is our fragility. If others reached complexity and lost it, then progress is not a promise but a phase. The ruins beneath our feet stop feeling distant. They feel anticipatory, like mirrors angled toward the future. And yet, there is no need to rush toward conclusion. History rarely reveals itself in a single revelation. It unfolds through patience, through the slow accumulation of inconsistencies that refuse to be ignored. The first crack in the narrative is rarely dramatic. It is a detail that lingers too long in the mind, a structure that seems too precise, a myth that knows too much, a disaster that arrives too suddenly. Perhaps the first civilizations did not vanish in flames or waves alone. Perhaps they vanished when their stories could no longer be translated into the languages that followed them. When meaning broke apart, facts dissolved into fable. What survived was not instruction, but warning, not blueprints, but unease. As we move forward in this quiet exploration, it may be useful to release the need for certainty, to allow the past to remain partially veiled, to notice where the official record grows quiet, and where the earth, the myths, and the mathematics continue to murmur. Somewhere in that overlapping whisper, the idea of their multiple endings begins to take shape, not as an answer, but as a rhythm. A pattern of rise, fracture, forgetting and return that may be far older than we are ready to admit. When memory stretches far enough back, it begins to blur, not because nothing happened, but because too much did. The distant past is not empty, it is crowded with impressions that overlap and interfere, like voices speaking at once through stone walls. What remains audible are not dates or names, but sensations, cold arriving too quickly, water climbing where it never had before, skies behaving as though they had forgotten their own rules. These impressions surface again and again, encoded not in data, but in stories that survived precisely because they were not precise. Across continents that never spoke to one another, ancient cultures carried remarkably similar recollections of catastrophe. Not identical narratives, but shared emotional contours, a world out of balance, a sudden correction, a cleansing that erased almost everything except a few witnesses who drifted, climbed, or hid until the earth grew quiet again. These accounts were preserved not as history but as warning. Compressed into myth so they could survive the erosion of time, they were not meant to convince, they were meant to be remembered. Modern geology offers its own uneasy harmonies with these ancient echoes. There is evidence of abrupt shifts at the end of the last ice age, moments when the climate did not gently transition, but lurched. Vast ice sheets melted with alarming speed. Sea levels rose not by inches but by tens of meters, swallowing coastlines where humans had lived for generations. Rivers changed course. Fertile plains disappeared beneath shallow seas. For communities rooted in place, such changes would not have felt gradual. They would have felt apocalyptic. If early civilizations had clustered along coasts and river deltas, as humans naturally do, their destruction would have been nearly total. Stone structures might survive inland, but harbours, dwellings, tools, and records would vanish beneath sediment and salt. What had once been centres of culture would become blank spaces on the map, later rediscovered only as submerged anomalies or dismissed as natural formations. The sea is a patient archivist, but it does not label its shelves. Fire tells a parallel story. The geological record speaks of periods when the Earth was struck repeatedly by objects from space, not always large enough to leave dramatic craters, but sufficient to ignite regional infernos, darken skies, and disrupt climate systems. Even without direct impact, debris entering the atmosphere can alter temperature and precipitation for years. To a civilization without modern forecasting, the sun dimming or the seasons failing would feel less like coincidence and more like betrayal by the cosmos itself. What happens to knowledge in such moments is rarely discussed. Knowledge assumes continuity. Teachers who live long enough to teach, students who grow old enough to remember. Catastrophe breaks this chain. Survivors do not prioritize abstraction. They prioritize warmth, shelter, food, and safety. The skills that endure are practical and immediate. The rest become excess weight. Astronomy becomes useless when the sky no longer behaves. Architecture loses relevance when no ground feels permanent. Writing fades when there is no time to preserve it. Over time, fragments of this lost understanding resurface in unexpected ways. Ancient structures aligned to solstices and equinoxes suggest careful observation of the heavens, yet the cultures that inherited these sites often no longer understood how or why they worked. The knowledge was there, embedded in stone, but the context had dissolved. Ritual replaced explanation. Reverence replaced comprehension. What had once been calculation became ceremony. There is a subtle tragedy in this transformation, not because myth is inferior to science, but because it signals a break. A moment when understanding slipped beyond reach and could only be held symbolically. Myths do not lie. They condense. They protect truth by hiding it inside metaphor, where it can survive suspicion, censorship, and forgetting. A flood story is easier to pass down than a hydrological record. A wrathful sky god is easier to remember than orbital mechanics. As centuries passed, new societies rose on altered landscapes. Shorelines stabilized, forests returned, rivers settled into new beds. To those born into these quieter times, catastrophe belonged to legend. The ruins they encountered were interpreted through available frameworks: temples, tombs, offerings to gods. The idea that these remnants might belong to a people not so different from themselves, who had faced their own version of modernity, was unthinkable. History prefers to imagine ancestors as simpler, not as peers. Yet the Earth does not reset cleanly. It leaves scars. Meltwater pulses leave chemical signatures. Sudden extinctions leave gaps in the fossil record. Human populations show bottlenecks, periods when numbers shrink dramatically before expanding again. These are not stories, but measurements. They do not explain motive or meaning, but they mark interruption. They say without language that continuity was broken. If this was the end of a civilization, or several, it may not have been a single event, but a sequence. A destabilization followed by adaptation, followed by forgetting. Collapse does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion, as systems stretch too thin to respond to change, as trust in the familiar that proves misplaced. When recovery finally comes, it builds forward, not backward. The old world becomes inaccessible, not because it is forbidden, but because the path to it no longer exists. There is something unsettling about recognizing this pattern, not because it demands belief in a specific lost civilization, but because it reframes collapse as ordinary, as part of a cycle that does not require malice or conspiracy. Nature alone is sufficient. The Earth does not need intention to erase complexity. It only needs imbalance. And still, questions linger. Why do some structures appear so suddenly in the archaeological record, with no clear developmental lineage? Why does sophisticated knowledge seem to flicker on and off, rather than progress smoothly? Why do the oldest stories sound less like invention, and more like testimony spoken through a veil? These questions do not ask for immediate answers. They ask for attention. They suggest that the first endings may have been quieter than imagined, spread across generations who did not know they were living through the closing chapters of their world. By the time silence arrived, there may have been no one left to recognize it as an ending at all. There is a point where catastrophe no longer looks like catastrophe. Long after the waters retreat and the skies clear, after the dead are buried and the land is habitable again, something far less visible begins its work. It is the quiet erosion of continuity. What survives does not vanish in a single generation, but it thins, stretches, and slowly loses its internal logic. People continue to live among the remnants of a previous order, yet that order no longer speaks in a language they fully understand. In this phase, the most dangerous loss is not material but cognitive. Tools may remain, structures may endure, Even patterns of behavior can persist, but the reasons behind them begin to dissolve. Knowledge once held as a system becomes a collection of habits. Observation turns into repetition. Precision softens into approximation. What was once understood is now merely followed. The difference is subtle, almost impossible to detect from within because daily life still functions. Children grow up seeing monuments whose origins are never questioned. They inherit gestures without explanations, rules without context. These things feel ancient and therefore unquestionable. Over time, reverence replaces curiosity. The past becomes something to protect rather than something to decode. In this way, the remnants of an earlier civilization can paradoxically accelerate forgetting, because they appear complete enough to discourage inquiry, yet incomplete enough to mislead. Archaeological layers hint at this transition. There are moments where craftsmanship declines not abruptly, but unevenly. Some techniques remain astonishingly precise, while others regress. It is as if certain skills were memorized rather than understood, preserved by imitation alone. When conditions change, these memorized skills fail because they cannot adapt. Understanding allows flexibility. Memory alone does not. This pattern extends into social organization. Complex societies rely on specialization, on networks of trust, on shared assumptions about stability. After a great disruption, these assumptions become liabilities. People retreat towards simpler structures, smaller groups, immediate concerns. Leadership becomes symbolic. Authority attaches itself to lineage, myth, or perceived divine favor rather than demonstrated competence. This is not because people become less intelligent, but because survival rewards certainty over experimentation. Language quietly records this shift. Words once used to describe measurable phenomena drift toward metaphor. Technical descriptions become poetic. Instructions become invocations. Over generations, the vocabulary of cause and effect erodes, replaced by language of intention and will. The river no longer floods because of seasonal melt. It floods because it is angry. The sky no longer darkens due to debris or ash. It darkens because it has turned away. This transformation does not indicate ignorance. It indicates adaptation. Stories survive where manuals do not. Emotion carries information longer than detail. A narrative that evokes fear or reverence is more likely to be remembered than an explanation that requires careful reasoning. In a world shaped by uncertainty, myth becomes a storage device for experience, compact and resilient. As centuries pass, even these myths begin to fragment. Variations emerge. Local landscapes reshape shared memories. A single ancestral event splits into many versions, each reflecting the environment and anxieties of the people who tell it. What remains constant is not accuracy, but tone, a sense of warning, a memory of imbalance, an intuition that something once went terribly wrong and that it could happen again. This is where later civilizations inherit a distorted archive. They encounter ruins without manuals, stories without timelines, rituals without origins. Attempting to make sense of these inheritances, they impose their own frameworks. Temples are built atop older foundations. Gods are layered onto older symbols. New meanings overwrite old ones, not maliciously, but inevitably. Each generation translates the past into terms it can comprehend. In doing so, they also erase evidence of loss. A ritual explained as religion no longer invites investigation into its practical origins. A structure explained as ceremonial no longer raises questions about its engineering. Over time, the possibility that these remnants belong to a society with a different, but equally valid form of sophistication becomes uncomfortable. It threatens the belief that progress is linear and irreversible. There is a particular silence that surrounds this discomfort. It appears in textbooks that skip abruptly over long spans of time, in phrases like sudden emergence or mysterious decline. In the absence of transitional explanations, these silences are not necessarily intentional. They reflect the limits of surviving evidence, yet they also reveal a reluctance to dwell on vulnerability, on the idea that knowledge itself can collapse. The ending of a civilization, seen this way, is not a dramatic fall but a slow misalignment. Structures continue to stand but no longer mean the same thing. Words continue to be spoken but point to different realities. The past becomes increasingly symbolic, increasingly sacred, increasingly distant. Eventually it becomes unreachable, not because it is hidden, but because no one remembers how to ask the questions that would reveal it. By the time writing returns in force, what is recorded is already an echo. Histories begin not at the true beginning, but at the edge of memory. What came before is framed as myth, prehistory, or divine age. The possibility that it was simply another human chapter, ended by forces indifferent to ambition, feels too destabilizing to explore fully. And so the first civilizations may have ended not with a final moment of destruction, but with a quiet surrender of comprehension. A time when people still lived among the works of their predecessors, still told stories about them, still felt their presence, yet no longer understood what they had known or how they had lived. The true ending was not when the world broke, but when understanding did. After that, silence did not arrive suddenly. It settled gradually, like dust on abandoned stone, until even the memory of forgetting was forgotten. When the fragments of earlier worlds no longer threaten survival, they begin to threaten meaning. This is the stage where memory, once fragile, becomes organized. Not recovered, not clarified, but arranged. After generations of uncertainty, societies instinctively reach for structure, and structure brings boundaries. What can be remembered safely is preserved. What destabilizes the present is softened, simplified, or quietly set aside. At first, this ordering feels necessary. People emerging from long periods of disruption crave coherence. They want to know where they came from, why suffering occurred, and what rules will prevent it from returning. Into this need step systems that promise answers, cosmologies, hierarchies, sacred narratives, lineages of authority. These systems do not invent memory from nothing. They select from what remains, shaping it into stories that support stability rather than inquiry. The past, once fluid and layered, begins to harden. Events are framed with moral clarity. Complex transitions are reduced to cautionary tales. The unknown becomes intentional rather than accidental. Catastrophe is no longer the result of indifferent forces. It is explained as punishment, correction, or destiny. In this framing, ambiguity is dangerous. It invites doubt, and doubt weakens cohesion. Over time, interpretation becomes ownership. Those who control the telling of origins gain influence over identity. They decide which fragments of ancient knowledge are acceptable and which are unsettling. This control does not always rely on force. It relies on repetition. Stories told often enough begin to feel complete. Alternatives fade simply because they are not heard. Writing plays a quiet but decisive role here. Once knowledge is fixed into text, it gains authority. What is written feels deliberate, even when it is partial. Oral traditions, once capable of adapting to new understanding, are labelled unreliable. Yet writing captures memory at a single moment, embedding the assumptions and blind spots of its time. What is excluded becomes invisible to future readers, not because it was disproven, but because it was never recorded. This is where the idea of a clean beginning takes root. Timelines start where records start. Everything before that is pushed into a vague distance, described as mythic, symbolic, or pre-rational. The silence before history is treated as natural, rather than as a consequence of loss. In this silence, entire chapters disappear without resistance. As these narratives settle, they shape perception itself. Earlier ages are imagined as simple, static, or childlike. Their monuments are admired aesthetically but stripped of technical significance. Precision becomes coincidence. Sophistication becomes mystery rather than evidence. The possibility that knowledge once existed in forms unfamiliar to modern categories becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Institutions reinforce this narrowing without necessarily intending to deceive. Education prioritizes continuity over rupture. Religion prioritizes meaning over mechanism. Governance prioritizes legitimacy over uncertainty. Each system, acting in its own interest, discourages interpretations that imply fragility or recurrence of collapse. Together they produce a shared assumption that the present stands apart from the past, safer, wiser, and fundamentally different. Yet anomalies persist. They appear as misfits within accepted chronologies, techniques that emerge too suddenly, alignments that suggest careful observation without corresponding records. myths that preserve technical detail beneath symbolic language. These are acknowledged cautiously, then contained. They are labelled outliers, curiosities, or unresolved questions. Rarely are they allowed to rearrange the larger picture. This containment is not conspiracy, it is inertia. Paradigms resist change because change demands re-evaluation not only of facts, but of identity. If civilizations have risen and fallen repeatedly, then progress is not guaranteed. If knowledge can be lost wholesale, then mastery is temporary. These implications unsettle societies built on the promise of permanence. As centuries pass, this managed memory becomes invisible. It feels like truth rather than selection. What is absent is no longer noticed. The gaps feel natural. People learn history as a sequence rather than a pattern. Beginnings feel singular. Endings feel exceptional. The idea of recurrence fades. In this environment, questioning the depth of the past feels unnecessary at best and destabilizing at worst. To suggest that earlier civilizations may have reached heights comparable to later ones implies that collapse is not a failure of morality alone, nor of ignorance, but an inherent risk of complexity. Such a suggestion offers no comfort, only caution, and so the first civilizations, whatever their forms, do not vanish only through disaster. They vanish through reinterpretation. Their remnants are absorbed into new meanings. Their warnings are softened into allegory. Their achievements are admired without being understood. Over time, they cease to function as evidence of alternative futures and become decorations in a story that insists on inevitability. What remains is a polished surface, a history that appears continuous, purposeful, and complete. Beneath it, layers still exist, compressed, misaligned, waiting. Not for revelation, but for attention. The silence surrounding them is not empty, it is maintained. By the time this process finishes its work, the past is no longer something that can surprise, it is something that reassures. It confirms what the present already believes about itself. The earlier worlds, once real and fragile, are rendered abstract and safe, and yet the ground beneath this certainty continues to shift, indifferent to the stories built upon it. There is a moment when certainty begins to crack, not loudly, not with confrontation, but with discomfort. It emerges when familiar explanations no longer sit easily with the evidence that keeps resurfacing. The past, once neatly arranged, begins to feel crowded again. Patterns appear that resist isolation. Connections suggest themselves across distances that should have prevented contact. It becomes harder to believe that all anomalies are coincidence, yet equally difficult to name what they imply. One of the most unsettling patterns is repetition. Certain forms appear again and again across cultures that never shared language or geography. Not merely symbols, but structural ideas. Ways of dividing space. Ways of marking time. Ways of orienting human life in relation to the sky, the land, and the unseen forces assumed to govern both. These similarities are often explained through universal psychology or convergent development, and sometimes that explanation is sufficient, but sometimes it feels incomplete. Like a story that answers the question while leaving the unease intact. Consider how many early cultures organized their calendars around cycles far longer than a single human lifetime. How they tracked slow celestial movements that require patient observation across generations. How they encoded this knowledge into architecture, ritual, and myth, so that it would persist even if the original observers did not. This kind of continuity assumes stability. It assumes that future generations will inherit not only the structures, but the reasons behind them. When that assumption fails, the structures remain, but their meaning drifts. What survives then is a kind of ghost knowledge, accurate enough to function symbolically, but detached from its original context. A solstice alignment becomes a festival. A geometric ratio becomes sacred harmony. A practical warning becomes a moral lesson. None of these transformations are wrong, but they are incomplete. They preserve shape without preserving intent. As these fragments accumulate, they form a quiet challenge to the idea of isolated origins. It becomes increasingly difficult to treat each civilization as an independent experiment when they seem to inherit similar anxieties, similar reverence for certain numbers, directions, and cycles. The resemblance does not require a global empire or lost super technology. It only requires continuity broken unevenly, knowledge passed forward through collapse, fragmented but persistent. This raises a deeper discomfort. If earlier civilizations existed and fell, then the present is not an endpoint. It is a phase, and phases imply transitions. The idea that humanity has restarted itself multiple times is not inherently dramatic. It is, however, destabilizing. It reframes history as iterative rather than accumulative, not a ladder but a wave. In this framing, collapse is not an aberration caused by failure alone. It is a consequence of complexity interacting with a volatile environment. The more interconnected a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to disruption. Trade networks magnify shortages. Specialization magnifies loss. Centralization magnifies error. These are not moral flaws, they are structural realities. Ancient warnings may have emerged from lived experience with this truth, not in the language of policy or engineering, but in story. Tales of hubris, imbalance, and divine correction may not be metaphysical claims at all. They may be reflections of societies that watched their own systems exceed their ability to adapt. When those systems failed, explanation turned inward, because the external forces felt too large to confront directly. This interpretation does not diminish the power of myth, it deepens it. Myth becomes a record of systemic failure, encoded in forms that could survive suspicion and censorship. A story can travel where a technical manual cannot. A symbol can endure where a statistic dissolves. In this sense, myth is not a rival to history, it is a carrier wave. Yet modern frameworks often resist this reading. To acknowledge that myth may contain compressed empirical memory threatens the boundary between rationality and imagination. It suggests that earlier peoples observed carefully, even if they explained poetically. It implies that dismissal of ancient accounts as superstition may say more about modern blind spots than ancient ones. As scholars encounter more data that challenges linear timelines, whether through unexpected dating results, unexplained technological sophistication, or abrupt demographic shifts, the language used to describe these findings grows cautious. Words like enigmatic, anomalous, and poorly understood appear frequently. These words signal honesty, but they also signal pause. They mark the edge of what is currently acceptable to integrate. Beyond that edge lies speculation, and speculation carries risk. It can be abused, exaggerated, or weaponized. But avoiding it entirely carries a different risk: stagnation. Without speculation, questions remain unasked. Without questions, patterns remain unseen. The first civilizations, if they existed, may not demand belief. They demand curiosity. There is also an emotional resistance at play. To imagine that others may have faced similar crises and failed introduces an uncomfortable mirror. It suggests that intelligence does not guarantee endurance, that knowledge does not automatically protect against loss, that adaptation, not advancement, is the true measure of survival. These are not comforting conclusions. Still, the past continues to intrude. It does so quietly, through measurements that shift dates backward, through ruins that defy simple classification, through stories that refuse to fade despite their supposed irrelevance. Each intrusion is small, none are decisive. Together, they exert pressure. This pressure does not insist on a single alternative history. It invites reconsideration of assumptions. It suggests that humanity's story may be less about firsts and more about returns, that what feels unprecedented may have echoes, that endings leave traces not only in stone, but in cautionary memory. If this is so, then the first civilizations did not disappear completely. They dissolved into influence. Their failures shaped the instincts of those who followed. Their warnings became allegory. Their achievements became mystery. Their presence lingers not as proof, but as tension, a sense that something has been forgotten that matters. As this tension grows, it becomes harder to maintain the comfort of simple narratives. The shoreline of history begins to look less like a boundary, and more like a recurring tide. And somewhere beneath that rhythm, the question is no longer whether others came before us, but whether we are listening closely enough to what they tried, in their own quiet way, to leave behind. At some point, attention shifts from what was lost to what endured. Not monuments alone, but instincts. Not facts, but patterns of behavior that feel older than explanation. These patterns surface when societies face uncertainty, They reveal how deeply the past may have shaped responses long after its details faded. In moments of stress, humans do not invent reactions from nothing. They reach backward, drawing from inherited reflexes whose origins are rarely examined. One such reflex is the impulse to build upward. When danger is associated with water, with crowding, with unpredictability below, height becomes safety. Hills become sacred. Mountains become homes of gods. Towers become symbols of protection and order. This preference appears repeatedly, not as architectural coincidence, but as embodied memory. It suggests that elevation once mattered in a way that left an imprint deeper than conscious recall. Another enduring instinct is the urge to encode warnings in story rather than instruction. Cultures that experience sudden loss learned, perhaps unconsciously, that technical precision is fragile. It depends on continuity. Stories do not. They travel across generations with minimal infrastructure. They adapt without erasing their emotional core. Fear, awe, humility. These survive translation even when detail does not. In this sense, emotion becomes a vessel for information. This may explain why so many ancient narratives emphasize balance over conquest. Excess overreach is punished. Disregard for limits leads to downfall. These themes are often interpreted as moral teaching, yet they may also reflect systemic memory. A recognition that complexity, when unmoored from restraint, becomes brittle. That success carries within it the conditions of its own undoing. As civilizations rebuild after disruption, they often emphasize harmony with perceived cosmic order. Calendars, rituals, and taboos emerge that regulate behavior in subtle ways. Planting aligns with cycles, construction avoids certain times, speech itself becomes governed by auspicious and forbidden moments. These practices may appear irrational when stripped of context, but they function as stabilizers. They slow decision-making. They embed caution into daily life. Over time, these inherited cautions harden into identity. People no longer remember why certain boundaries exist. They only know that crossing them feels dangerous. The boundary becomes sacred. Violation becomes transgression. This transformation preserves the warning while obscuring its source. The original threat fades, but the structure built to prevent its return remains. There is a quiet cost to this preservation. When caution becomes dogma, adaptation slows. What once protected now constrains. The environment changes again, but the inherited rules remain fixed. A society optimized to prevent a past disaster may become vulnerable to a new one. Memory protects, but it can also mislead when it outlives its relevance. This tension between remembering and adapting shapes the arc of civilizations. Too much forgetting invites repetition. Too much rigidity invites stagnation. The balance is delicate, and it is rarely achieved intentionally. It emerges through trial, loss, and reinterpretation. Each civilization inherits not only tools and stories, but unresolved negotiations between fear and ambition. In this light, the idea of multiple prior civilizations becomes less about hidden grandeur and more about accumulated caution. Each rise leaves behind not just ruins, but behavioral residues. These residues influence how later societies approach risk, authority, and the unknown. They shape what feels acceptable, what feels forbidden, and what feels inevitable. Modern societies are not exempt from this inheritance. They too carry instincts whose origins are rarely questioned. The urge to document obsessively, the reliance on abstraction, the faith that redundancy equals safety. These may be responses to earlier failures, encoded not in myth, but in systems. When data is feared to be fragile, it is multiplied. When continuity is doubted, backups proliferate. The impulse is ancient, even if its expression is new. Yet there is a danger in mistaking preservation for immunity. The past does not repeat itself precisely, but it rhymes in unexpected ways. Environmental thresholds once crossed do not announce themselves with ceremony. Systems fail not because they are evil or foolish, but because they are stressed beyond design. Earlier civilizations may have learned this too late. Their memory of that lesson survives, but its application remains uncertain. What lingers most persistently is not fear of destruction, but fear of forgetting. The anxiety that what matters most will not survive translation into the future. This anxiety drives monuments, archives, rituals, and laws. It motivates preservation at scales that sometimes exceed practicality. It reveals an awareness, however dim, that continuity is not guaranteed. If earlier worlds ended, they may have done so with the same mixture of confidence and unease, a belief in resilience tempered by a sense of fragility. They may have left behind not explicit warnings, but pressures, shaping the instincts of those who followed. These pressures surface whenever certainty feels excessive, whenever progress accelerates faster than understanding. In quieter moments, this inherited tension expresses itself as restlessness, a sense that something essential is missing from the official story. That advancement without reflection carries a hollow tone. That speed feels impressive, but depth feels safer. These feelings are difficult to justify with evidence, yet they persist across cultures and eras. The endurance of such instincts suggests that the past has not been erased so much as compressed. Its lessons have been distilled into patterns of caution, reverence, and repetition. These patterns do not announce themselves as history. They operate beneath awareness, guiding choices that feel intuitive rather than reasoned. If humanity is indeed living through a later chapter, in a long sequence of rises and resets, then these instincts are not relics. They are signals. They indicate where earlier attempts strained and where they broke. They hint at vulnerabilities that may not be obvious when systems appear stable. The challenge lies not in proving the existence of earlier civilizations, but in recognizing the influence of their endings. Influence does not require evidence carved in stone. It requires continuity of behavior, of anxiety, of restraint. These are harder to excavate, but no less real. As attention turns toward the future, these inherited patterns remain active, quietly shaping expectations. They ask not for belief, but for awareness. They suggest that survival may depend less on innovation alone and more on the humility to recognize limits that have been tested before. The past, in this sense, has not finished speaking. It has simply learned to whisper, embedding its warnings in instincts we rarely question, waiting for moments of imbalance to make them audible again. As attention drifts further from origins and toward mechanisms, another layer of the story begins to surface, one that feels colder, less emotional, yet no less unsettling. It is the layer where collapse is no longer framed through myth or memory, but through systems. Here the question is not what people believed happened, but how entire worlds could unravel without a single dramatic cause. The silence surrounding these endings begins to resemble the silence inside a machine that has stopped working, not because of one broken piece, but because many small failures aligned. Complexity carries a hidden cost. The more specialized a civilization becomes, the more it relies on invisible coordination. Food depends on transport. Transport depends on energy. Energy depends on extraction, distribution, and trust. Knowledge fragments into professions that no longer understand one another's foundations. This structure is efficient, even elegant, but it is also brittle. When one layer falters, the stress transfers elsewhere, often unnoticed until it is too late to correct. Earlier societies may have crossed this threshold without recognizing it. What appears from a distance as sudden collapse may have felt, from within, like a series of manageable inconveniences, a failed harvest here, a delayed shipment there, a ritual adjusted, a boundary moved, each decision rational, each response local. The system adapts, but in doing so, it loses resilience. Flexibility becomes dependence. When adaptation replaces redundancy, recovery narrows. The system no longer remembers how to function without its full structure intact. At this stage, disruption does not need to be extreme. A modest environmental shift, a prolonged drought, a change in trade winds, a cooling climate, any of these can cascade through a civilization optimized for stability rather than variation. What follows is not immediate ruin, but strain. Strain alters behavior, cooperation erodes, authority tightens, innovation slows as risk becomes unacceptable, resources are hoarded, narratives harden. The future becomes something to defend rather than imagine. From the outside, this may look like cultural decline. From the inside, it feels like realism. There is a peculiar blindness that accompanies this phase. Success in the past becomes evidence against the need for change. Systems that worked once are assumed to work again. Warning signs are interpreted as temporary anomalies rather than structural signals. This confidence is not arrogance, it is inertia. It arises from familiarity. The system has no language for its own fragility. In this context, earlier civilizations may not have ended so much as exceeded their capacity to self-correct. They continued forward, not because it was wise, but because reversal felt unthinkable. Complexity does not retreat easily. It demands maintenance, not simplification. When maintenance fails, complexity collapses inward. What survives such collapse is uneven. Centralized institutions fall hardest. Peripheral communities adapt more easily. Knowledge concentrated in elites disappears faster than knowledge distributed through practice. This creates the illusion that civilization vanished completely, when in reality it fragmented. The visible structures failed, the invisible habits persisted. Over generations, these fragments recombine. New societies form from the edges inward. They inherit tools without blueprints, rituals without explanations, landscapes reshaped by forces no longer remembered. From their perspective, the world has always been this way. The ruins they encounter feel alien, belonging to an incomprehensible age. The idea that these structures were once part of a living, functioning system feels implausible. This fragmentation obscures causality. When collapse is gradual and distributed, there is no single moment to remember. No clear villain, no decisive mistake. Only a slow misalignment between environment, technology, and social structure. The story resists compression. It cannot be easily told, so it fades. Modern analysis often searches for singular explanations: climate change, conflict, disease, invasion. Each may contribute, but none operate in isolation. Systems fail through accumulation. Pressure builds invisibly, thresholds are crossed quietly. By the time collapse is recognized as collapse, it is already irreversible. If earlier civilizations experienced this pattern, their silence becomes more understandable. They did not leave warnings because they did not perceive an ending approaching. They were responding to symptoms, not diagnosing the system. Their myths, rituals, and taboos may represent attempts to restore balance without understanding the full scope of imbalance. This raises an uncomfortable parallel. The feeling that everything is under control often precedes the realization that control was an illusion. Systems appear stable right up until the moment they are not. Complexity disguises vulnerability by distributing it. No single failure looks fatal until the network can no longer absorb stress. The absence of dramatic endings in the deep past may not indicate absence of collapse, but absence of spectacle. Civilizations can fade without fire or flood, dissolving into smaller, simpler forms that continue quietly. From a distance, this looks like disappearance. From within, it feels like survival. As this perspective settles, the idea of a first civilization gives way to something more nuanced. Not a towering precursor erased by catastrophe, but a sequence of attempts, each shaped by its environment, each constrained by its own structures, each learning incomplete lessons from what came before. Progress becomes cyclical, not in repetition, but in rhythm. What lingers from these cycles is not technological continuity, but cautionary structure, an intuition that systems must remain flexible, that specialization must be balanced with redundancy, that resilience matters more than efficiency. These intuitions surface in different forms across eras, often ignored during expansion and rediscovered during contraction. The past, viewed through this lens, is not a warning carved in stone. It is a pattern etched into behavior. It suggests that endings rarely announce themselves. They arrive as maintenance issues, as coordination failures, as trust eroded too slowly to feel urgent. In the quiet after collapse, when the system has simplified itself by force, what remains is space. Space to rebuild differently. Space to forget what no longer fits. Space to begin again, believing, perhaps sincerely, that this time will be different. Whether that belief is justified remains unresolved. The pattern does not insist on despair. It invites attention. It asks for awareness of thresholds that cannot be crossed indefinitely. It suggests that the silence surrounding earlier endings is not emptiness, but complexity misunderstood. And as this understanding settles, the question shifts once more, not toward what destroyed the first civilizations, but toward what they failed to see while everything still appeared to be working. At a certain depth of reflection, the ruins and the systems recede into the background. And something more elusive comes into focus. It is not what earlier civilizations built, nor even how they failed, but how they understood the world while it still appeared dependable. The end of a civilization often begins not with collapse, but with a subtle narrowing of perception. Long before structures crack, assumptions quietly harden. Human societies require predictability to function. Coordination depends on expectation. Planting assumes seasons will return. Trade assumes routes will remain open. Authority assumes recognition. These assumptions are not foolish. They are necessary. Without them, collective life would dissolve into hesitation. Yet the same assumptions that enable growth also carry risk. They teach the mind to expect continuity, even when continuity is no longer guaranteed. In periods of long stability, perception adapts to the familiar. Rare events feel irrelevant. Extremes are discounted. What has not happened in memory is treated as impossible. This is not denial, but efficiency. Attention is finite, and it is spent where reward has been reliable. Earlier civilizations may have thrived precisely because they learned to ignore noise. Unfortunately, this skill becomes dangerous when the noise is a signal. The deeper record of the planet suggests that change is not always incremental. Stability can persist for centuries, then fracture abruptly. Climate shifts, tectonic adjustments, and cosmic disturbances do not scale themselves to human expectations. They obey their own thresholds. Earlier cultures may have sensed this instability indirectly. Their stories speak of sudden reversals, of worlds that tilt without warning. But sensing is not the same as preparing. Preparation requires imagination, and imagination is constrained by success. When systems work, imagination contracts. The future becomes an extension of the present rather than a departure from it. Risk models assume continuity. Plans assume correction will be possible. Warnings that challenge these assumptions feel abstract, even indulgent. This perceptual narrowing reshapes interpretation. Unexpected events are explained using familiar frameworks. A prolonged drought becomes a moral failing. A failed harvest becomes a ritual error. A disrupted cycle becomes punishment or imbalance. These explanations preserve meaning, but they delay structural response. They treat anomalies as deviations rather than indicators. Over time, this habit of interpretation creates inertia. Systems adapt symbolically instead of materially. Rituals intensify. Authority consolidates. Reassurance replaces revision. From within the civilization, these responses feel stabilizing. From outside, in retrospect, they look like hesitation. What makes this process difficult to detect is its gradual nature. No single decision appears fatal. Each adjustment seems reasonable. The danger lies not in error, but in accumulation. Assumptions stack. Flexibility erodes. The margin for surprise shrinks. Earlier civilizations may have reached a point where their understanding of the world no longer matched the world itself. Their models became precise within familiar ranges, yet blind beyond them. They could predict cycles, but not disruptions to cycles. They could optimize for known conditions, but not adapt to new ones. Their confidence was not misplaced, it was outdated. When reality diverges from perception, stress follows. Stress alters priorities. Long-term planning gives way to short-term survival. Cooperation frays. Trust becomes conditional. Information flows distort as people seek reassurance rather than accuracy. In such environments, even correct insights struggle to gain traction. They feel disruptive rather than helpful. This is where fragmentation begins. Central coordination weakens. Local solutions proliferate. Knowledge becomes unevenly distributed. Some groups adapt by simplifying. Others cling to complexity that no longer functions. The civilization does not collapse uniformly, it unravels. From the perspective of later generations, this unraveling appears abrupt. Records thin. Craftsmanship declines unevenly. Populations shift. The reasons are unclear because the process did not feel like an ending at the time. It felt like coping. As memory fades, the perceptual failure that preceded collapse disappears entirely. What remains is a simplified narrative, a prosperous age followed by decline. The internal misalignment between expectation and reality is lost. The lesson becomes moral or symbolic rather than cognitive. Yet that lost lesson may be one of the most important inheritances. It suggests that civilizations do not fail only because of external forces, but because of how they interpret those forces. That perception itself can become a vulnerability. That success can dull awareness as effectively as ignorance. This idea is uncomfortable because it offers no clear remedy. One cannot simply choose to perceive uncertainty more accurately. Awareness competes with convenience. Vigilance competes with efficiency. The mind naturally favors stability because stability rewards it most of the time. Modern societies face the same tension. Models grow increasingly detailed. Predictions extend further. Confidence increases alongside unease. Surprise remains constant even as understanding deepens. This paradox is not new. It echoes earlier moments when knowledge expanded faster than adaptability. If earlier civilizations ended, part of their ending may have occurred quietly within perception, when assumptions went unchallenged because challenging them felt unnecessary or destabilizing. Their silence afterward reflects this. They did not leave clear warnings because they did not recognize a threshold being crossed. Their attention was focused on maintaining normalcy, not on imagining its failure. What persists from these endings is not instruction, but pressure, a faint discomfort with certainty, an intuition that systems deserve scrutiny even when they appear stable. These intuitions surface in philosophy, in art, in recurring doubt about permanence. They are often dismissed as pessimism, yet they may represent compressed memory. The past, viewed through this lens, does not accuse, it suggests. It implies that awareness must extend beyond patterns that have held so far, that resilience depends on noticing when familiarity becomes assumption, that the most dangerous changes are those that do not announce themselves. As this layer of understanding settles, the question shifts again. It no longer centers on which catastrophe ended earlier civilizations or even how many there were. It turns inward, toward the quiet habits of thought that shape response, toward the limits of perception that success itself creates. Somewhere in that inward turn lies a fragile opportunity. Not to predict endings, but to remain aware of the assumptions that make endings invisible until they arrive. The earlier worlds may not have failed to see the future. They may have failed to see the present changing beneath their expectations. And in that realization, the silence they left behind feels less like absence and more like an unfinished sentence, one that still waits to be completed by those willing to listen beyond what feels certain. As the search moves deeper, the story grows quieter, not because there is less to say, but because what remains is harder to name. Beneath catastrophe, beneath perception, beneath systems and authority, there is another force shaping the fate of civilizations. It is the relationship between humans and time itself. Not time as measured, but time as felt, anticipated, and trusted. Civilizations do not merely live in time, they make agreements with it. They assume continuity. They plan decades ahead. They invest effort in structures that will outlast their builders. This confidence is not naive, it is necessary. Without faith in tomorrow, no complex society can function. Yet this faith subtly reshapes behavior. It trains people to believe that the future will arrive in familiar form, even if altered slightly at the edges. Earlier civilizations may have reached moments when this agreement with time quietly broke. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but through accumulation. Seasons still arrived, but less predictably. Resources still flowed, but with increasing friction. Knowledge still circulated, but more slowly, more unevenly. The future did not disappear. It merely stopped matching expectation. When this happens, societies respond by accelerating. They build faster, extract more, organize more tightly. The goal is not domination, but reassurance. Activity becomes a way to deny uncertainty. If enough effort is applied, continuity can be forced back into place. This response feels rational, even responsible, from within the moment. But acceleration has a cost. It consumes buffers, it reduces margins, it leaves less room for error. Over time, the civilization becomes efficient at maintaining itself under known conditions, but fragile under new ones. Its relationship with time shifts from partnership to struggle. This struggle is rarely recognized as such. It is interpreted through the language available, divine testing, moral decay, loss of virtue, foreign influence. The underlying tension, the sense that the future is slipping out of alignment, is difficult to articulate. It has no obvious symbol. It leaves no single artifact. As generations pass, this tension hardens into exhaustion. Maintenance replaces imagination. Preservation replaces curiosity. The past becomes something to protect. The future something to fear. Innovation is permitted only within narrow boundaries. Risk feels irresponsible. Change feels threatening. At this stage, collapse no longer requires an external trigger. The civilization has already lost its ability to adapt freely. Any significant disturbance, environmental, social, or internal, pushes against a system that can no longer bend. What follows appears sudden, only because the slow work of exhaustion went unrecorded. When the structure finally gives way, time itself feels fractured. The past becomes unreachable. The future becomes immediate and short. Survivors live in compressed horizons. Planning shrinks to seasons, then to days. Knowledge that once depended on long continuity, astronomy, engineering, complex coordination, loses relevance. Skills that matter now are those that function quickly, locally, reliably. In this contraction, entire ways of thinking vanish, not because they are false, but because they require a future that no longer feels certain. The deeper loss is not technology, but temporal imagination. The ability to think far ahead disappears, and with it, the ability to maintain complexity. Later generations inherit a world already simplified. To them, this simplicity feels normal. The idea that their ancestors lived inside longer arcs of time, planning centuries ahead, building for futures they would never see, feels alien. The ruins of such planning appear extravagant or mysterious. Their purpose is misunderstood because the mindset that produced them no longer exists. This loss reshapes memory. Stories compress time. Long declines become sudden falls. Extended adaptation becomes catastrophe. The truth is not deliberately obscured, it is rendered unintelligible. Without a sense of long duration, the slow unravelling of a civilization cannot be imagined. In this way, the endings of earlier civilizations leave little trace. They do not conclude with punctuation, but with fading. They are not erased by disaster alone, but by a gradual shortening of perspective. Time narrows, and with it, possibility. Modern observers searching for dramatic evidence, impact craters, global floods, decisive invasions, may miss this quieter ending entirely. The most important evidence is not what was destroyed, but what stopped being attempted. What kinds of projects ceased, what time horizons vanished, what ambitions became inconceivable. This perspective does not deny catastrophe, it reframes it. Disasters may have occurred, but they mattered most because they arrived at moments when civilizations had already lost temporal resilience. They struck systems stretched thin by acceleration and exhaustion. The damage they caused could no longer be absorbed. What remains after such endings is a strange inheritance. Instincts without explanation, warnings without context, a recurring sense that progress carries hidden fragility. These feelings surface in philosophy, in recurring anxiety about permanence, in the persistent fear that complexity may outpace wisdom. The idea that multiple civilizations rose and fell before us becomes less fantastical in this light. It requires no lost super technology, no hidden empire spanning the globe. It requires only the recognition that human societies repeatedly make agreements with time they cannot always keep. That when those agreements break, the consequences unfold slowly, invisibly, until they are irreversible. The silence left behind by earlier worlds may reflect this slow fading. They did not end with proclamations or final records. They drifted out of alignment with the future they expected, and by the time that misalignment became clear, the capacity to record it had already weakened. What follows is not emptiness, but layering. Each new civilization builds atop the temporal assumptions of those before it, inheriting not only land and tools, but unresolved tensions about continuity, control, and change. These tensions resurface whenever acceleration outruns adaptation. Seen this way, the past is not warning us of a specific fate. It is reminding us of a pattern. That complexity depends not only on intelligence and power, but on patience. That survival requires room for surprise, that the future must be allowed to differ from expectation without triggering panic. The earlier civilizations may have known this once. Their knowledge did not survive as instruction, but as atmosphere, a lingering unease around certainty, a reverence for balance, a suspicion of unchecked growth. These traces persist because they do not require memory. They live in instinct, and as the story continues, this instinct grows harder to ignore. Not because the past demands attention, but because the present increasingly resembles moments when time itself began to slip from familiar hands. As the inquiry moves forward, the idea of endings begins to feel less like an event and more like a condition. Earlier civilizations may not have fallen because something attacked them, but because something shifted inside the way they related to their own creations. What once felt empowering slowly became obligatory. What was designed to serve began to demand service in return. Every complex society builds layers: administrative, technological, symbolic. These layers begin as tools. They simplify coordination. They extend reach. They allow individuals to act as part of something larger than themselves. Over time, however, tools acquire momentum. They require maintenance, justification, expansion. They shape priorities. A civilization may reach a point where it no longer asks whether its systems are useful, only whether they can be sustained. This is a subtle inversion. Means become ends. Preservation replaces purpose. When this happens, change is perceived not as improvement, but as threat. The system resists revision because revision implies vulnerability. The cost of questioning grows higher than the cost of continuing. Earlier civilizations may have crossed this threshold quietly. Their technologies, institutions, and rituals continued to function, but the spirit that animated them shifted. Innovation narrowed. Experimentation became controlled. Solutions were sought within existing frameworks, even when those frameworks no longer matched reality. This persistence feels like stability from within. It looks like stagnation from afar. In such conditions, warning signs are reinterpreted. Declining returns are framed as temporary setbacks. Environmental stress is normalized. Social strain is attributed to moral weakness rather than structural mismatch. The civilization continues forward, not blindly, but habitually. The future is assumed to be a refined version of the present, not a departure from it. This assumption carries weight. It determines what kinds of ideas are entertained. Proposals that challenge the core structure are dismissed as unrealistic. Adaptation is allowed only if it preserves the system's identity. Flexibility is permitted at the margins, never at the center. Over time, the center hardens. The cost of this hardening is delayed response. When reality begins to diverge decisively, through climate, resource shifts, or internal imbalance, the civilization lacks pathways for rapid transformation. Its strength lies in optimization, not in reinvention. What once enabled expansion now constrains survival. At this stage, collapse no longer needs to arrive dramatically. It can enter through erosion. Trust weakens, coordination falters, the system becomes heavy, slow to react, expensive to maintain. Peripheral regions adapt independently. Central authority loses relevance. The civilization does not shatter, it loosens. What follows is a long unwinding. Not everyone experiences it as loss. Some find relief in simplification. Local autonomy grows. Life becomes smaller, more immediate. The grand narratives fade, replaced by practical concerns. To later observers, this looks like disappearance. To those living through it, it feels like adjustment. This gradual retreat leaves little record. Writing declines as institutions weaken. Monumental projects stop mid-construction. Knowledge that depended on large-scale coordination becomes unusable. Skills that can be practiced individually survive. Complexity drains away, not in panic, but in pragmatism. As generations pass, the memory of the earlier world becomes distorted. It is remembered either as a golden age or as a cautionary tale, depending on what serves the present. The nuanced reasons for its transformation are lost. What remains are symbols, ruins, myths, fragments of law or ritual. The lived experience of transition disappears. This disappearance feeds the illusion that collapse was sudden or mysterious. In reality, It may have been the natural conclusion of a long period of internal rigidity. The civilization did not fail to notice danger. It failed to imagine alternatives that did not preserve its existing form. This pattern repeats because it is deeply human. Societies, like individuals, grow attached to what they have built. Identity becomes entangled with structure. To change the structure feels like erasing the self. Preservation becomes emotional, not merely rational. Earlier civilizations may have reached moments when they sensed this entanglement, but could not resolve it. They may have felt the weight of their own systems, the exhaustion of maintenance without renewal. Their stories speak of cycles, of ages ending and beginning anew. These may not be prophecies, but acknowledgements of limits. In this light, the question of how many civilizations came before us becomes less important than how they related to their own momentum, whether they could step outside the frameworks that had defined their success, whether they could imagine futures that did not resemble their present. The silence they left behind suggests that many could not because they lacked wisdom, but because wisdom alone does not guarantee flexibility. Systems shape behavior. They reward conformity. They punish deviation. Over time, even insightful individuals become constrained by the structures they depend on. When collapse finally completes its work, what remains is potential. The ground is cleared, not by intention, but by attrition. New societies form from the remnants, unaware of the full shape of what came before. They inherit instincts, not instructions. They repeat some patterns and avoid others, without knowing why. This is how civilizations restart, not from zero but from residue. But each iteration carries forward lessons in altered form. Some lessons sharpen, others blur. The cycle continues, not because humans forget, but because memory alone cannot overcome structural inertia. Seen this way, the idea of a seventh civilization feels less like a claim and more like a position within a rhythm. A moment between accumulation and release, between expansion and recalibration. The past does not accuse, it contextualizes. What it offers is not certainty, but perspective. A reminder that endurance depends not only on growth, but on the willingness to loosen what no longer fits. That survival may require letting systems dissolve before they collapse. That flexibility, not permanence, is the deeper form of strength. As this understanding settles, the inquiry shifts once more, not toward fear of endings, but toward awareness of momentum, toward the question of whether a civilization can recognize when its tools have begun to define it, and whether it can choose transformation over exhaustion. The earlier worlds may not have answered that question in time. Their silence suggests the cost of delay. What remains open is whether recognizing the pattern changes the outcome, or merely adds another layer of understanding to the long-repeating story of rise, wait, and release. At this point in the journey, the idea of collapse has shed nearly all of its drama. It no longer resembles an ending imposed from outside, but a transformation unfolding from within. What remains to be examined is not what civilizations lose, but what they choose to protect when pressure mounts. In those choices, priorities are revealed, and in priorities, destinies quietly form. When survival feels uncertain, societies narrow their focus. Attention shifts toward what appears essential: food, shelter, security, continuity. Everything else becomes negotiable. Art fades before infrastructure. Philosophy yields to policy. Curiosity gives way to compliance. This narrowing is not cruelty. It is triage. Yet what is preserved under stress reshapes what the civilization becomes. Earlier civilizations may have faced moments when they had to decide, implicitly, not formally, what mattered enough to carry forward. These decisions were rarely conscious. They emerged through incentives. Skills that produced immediate benefit were taught. Knowledge that required long horizons was postponed. Over generations, this selective transmission altered the culture's internal balance. What is often lost first is synthesis, the ability to connect domains, to see relationships between climate and belief, technology and ethics, power and ecology. As specialization intensifies, understanding fragments. Experts know more about less. Coordination replaces comprehension. The system functions, but it no longer reflects on itself. This loss of synthesis creates a peculiar vulnerability. A civilization may possess vast knowledge, yet lack the means to integrate it into coherent response. Signals are detected but not connected. Data accumulates but does not translate into action. Responsibility diffuses across institutions until no one feels accountable for the whole. In earlier worlds, this diffusion may have appeared as ritual without insight, bureaucracy without vision, tradition without memory. The forms remained intact, but the animating awareness faded. What had once been adaptive wisdom hardened into procedure. Procedure is efficient, but it does not learn. As conditions continued to change, this rigidity demanded compensation. Rules multiplied, authority centralized, deviations were discouraged. Uniformity was mistaken for strength. Diversity of thought felt dangerous. In such an environment, the capacity to imagine alternatives diminished precisely when it was most needed. The civilization, still impressive in scale, began to hollow out. It could enforce order, but not generate renewal. It could preserve itself, but not redefine itself. The future narrowed to maintenance of the present. This hollowing is difficult to detect because it produces stability in the short term. Systems run smoothly. Predictability increases. Risk decreases until it does not. When a disruption arrives that cannot be absorbed by existing structures, the response is delayed, then disproportionate. The system lacks graceful failure. It swings between denial and overreaction. Earlier civilizations may have encountered such moments repeatedly, each time adapting just enough to continue, but not enough to transform. Each adaptation reduced resilience slightly, trading flexibility for control. Over time, the margin disappeared. When collapse finally manifested, it did so unevenly. Some regions adapted quickly by shedding complexity. Others clung to failing systems until resources were exhausted. The result was fragmentation rather than annihilation. Civilization did not vanish, it thinned. What survived this thinning were practices that could operate independently of large systems. Farming methods, basic crafts, oral memory, social bonds. What did not survive were abstractions dependent on scale, centralized administration, long-distance coordination, specialized knowledge networks. These require trust, surplus, and continuity. Without those, they dissolve. Later generations inherited a world simplified by necessity. To them, the earlier complexity felt excessive, even unnatural. The ruins of it inspired awe, but not imitation. They lacked the conditions required to recreate it, and perhaps the desire. In memory, the earlier civilization became something other than itself. It was remembered as either utopian or corrupt, enlightened or decadent. The truth, that it was complex, adaptive, constrained, and human, was too subtle to preserve. Nuance rarely survives collapse. This distortion feeds a recurring illusion that collapse erases wisdom. In reality, it often redistributes it. Knowledge condenses into proverbs, taboos, instincts. The lesson that centralization creates fragility may survive as suspicion of distant authority. The lesson that excess invites imbalance may survive as moral restraint. These are not technical instructions, but they are not meaningless. Over time, these distilled lessons shape the foundations of new societies. They influence what feels acceptable and what feels risky. They guide behavior without explanation. In this way, the endings of earlier civilizations continue to act, even when they are no longer remembered. The idea of multiple civilizations preceding our own becomes less mysterious in this light. It does not require extraordinary leaps or hidden histories. It requires only the recognition that complexity cycles, that societies expand, optimize, rigidify, and simplify. That memory adapts to preserve what seems essential, even as context changes. What becomes striking is how rarely civilizations choose to relinquish control voluntarily. Systems are allowed to collapse rather than be dismantled. The emotional investment in structure outweighs the rational case for transformation. People endure strain longer than they question identity. Earlier civilizations may have reached moments when they sensed this dilemma, but lacked the means to resolve it collectively. Individual insight does not easily translate into systemic change. The structures that reward conformity outlast the warnings that challenge them. This is where silence enters the historical record. Not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of unresolved tension. The past does not explain itself because explanation would require acknowledging limits, that no longer fit the story of continuity. As this understanding settles, the inquiry turns inward again. The question is no longer how civilizations end, but how they decide what to carry forward while ending. What values survive triage? What knowledge is deemed essential? What perspectives are allowed to persist when pressure demands simplicity? The answer is never neutral. It reflects fear, hope, habit, and power. It shapes the form of what comes next. Each civilization leaves behind not a blueprint, but a bias, a tilt towards certain solutions and away from others. In this sense, the earlier worlds have not vanished. They have contributed to a long accumulation of instincts about control, restraint, ambition, and balance. These instincts surface whenever systems feel strained. They whisper caution when certainty feels too strong. They urge simplification when complexity grows brittle. The past does not ask to be revived. It asks to be recognized as process rather than relic. To be understood not as a single lost peak, but as many attempts to negotiate the same tensions between growth and resilience, control and flexibility, memory and change. And as this layer of understanding comes into focus, the story prepares to move again, away from endings and toward the fragile space where choice still exists, where patterns can be noticed before they repeat, and where the silence of earlier worlds may yet inform what has not fully taken shape. As the story continues, attention turns toward a quieter inheritance, one that does not announce itself through ruins or myths, but through thresholds. Every civilization, regardless of era, lives with invisible lines it rarely names, lines between growth and strain, between coordination and coercion, between resilience and overextension. Earlier civilizations may have crossed these lines not once, but many times, each crossing subtle enough to seem reversible until it was not. Thresholds are difficult to perceive from within. They are not events, but conditions. A society can pass through them while everything still appears functional. Markets operate. Laws are enforced. Culture thrives. Yet beneath this activity, pressures accumulate. Energy must travel farther. Resources require more effort to extract. Decisions demand longer chains of approval. Complexity continues to grow, but its returns diminish. In this phase, the civilization appears strongest. Its reach is widest. Its confidence is highest. This is precisely what makes thresholds dangerous. Success disguises proximity to limits. Systems optimized for efficiency lose slack. Redundancy is labeled waste. Adaptability is replaced by procedure. What cannot be measured is ignored. Earlier civilizations may have encountered such moments repeatedly. Each time they adapted just enough to continue. They reorganized labor, centralized authority, standardized practices. These responses worked, temporarily, but each solution moved the system closer to rigidity. Each success reduced the margin for surprise. Over time, the civilization becomes exquisitely tuned to a specific set of conditions. Its infrastructure, beliefs, and incentives align around a narrow band of stability. Within that band, performance is remarkable. Outside it, response is slow. This tuning feels like mastery. It is in fact specialization. Specialization narrows imagination. The range of futures considered realistic shrinks. Alternatives that do not fit the tuned system feel implausible. Risk assessments assume continuity. Planning horizons extend confidently, but only along familiar paths. The unknown becomes an abstraction rather than a possibility. When conditions drift gradually, this specialization goes unnoticed. Adjustments are made incrementally. The system absorbs stress. But when change accelerates or arrives from an unexpected direction, specialization becomes a trap. The very structures that once ensured success now block transformation. Earlier civilizations may have sensed this trap without understanding it. Their records hint at anxiety during periods of apparent prosperity. Rituals multiply. Laws harden. Symbols of order become prominent. These are not signs of decadence. They are signs of a system attempting to reassure itself. As reassurance intensifies, dissent feels threatening. Alternative models are discouraged. Experimentation is confined. Diversity of approach narrows. The civilization becomes internally consistent at the expense of external responsiveness. It is stable until it is not. Crossing the final threshold rarely feels dramatic. There is no clear moment when the future becomes unreachable. Instead, options quietly disappear. Choices that were once available are no longer viable. Responses that once worked now amplify damage. The system begins to react against itself. When disruption arrives, whether environmental, social, or internal, it encounters a civilization with little room to bend. The response is delayed, then rigid. Control is tightened, extraction intensifies, coordination becomes enforcement. These measures buy time, but they also deepen dependence on conditions that are already shifting. Collapse, when it comes, appears sudden only because the slow narrowing of possibility was not recorded. The civilization did not fall from a peak. It stepped past a line it could not see and continued forward until reversal was impossible. What follows is not erasure, but release. Complexity sheds weight. Large systems fragment. Local adaptation returns. Life simplifies, not by choice, but by necessity. From within this simplification, the earlier world feels distant and abstract. Its scale seems excessive. Its ambitions feel misplaced. Later generations grow up without reference to the thresholds that shaped their inheritance. They know only the aftermath. The idea that prosperity once carried hidden constraints feels unintuitive. History is remembered as rise and fall, not as tuning and overreach. This amnesia allows the pattern to repeat. New societies rebuild complexity, rediscovering efficiency, specialization, and scale. They cross the same early thresholds with little difficulty. Success returns, confidence grows, the past feels irrelevant, yet the thresholds remain. They are not moral judgments, they are structural realities. They arise from finite resources, limited attention, and the costs of coordination. No civilization escapes them. Each negotiates them differently, with varying degrees of awareness. The notion of multiple civilizations preceding our own becomes clearer through this lens. Not as a sequence of grand catastrophes, but as a series of crossings. Each civilization tuned itself to a moment in time, thrived within that tuning, and then struggled when the world shifted beyond it. What survives these crossings is not instruction, but intuition, a lingering discomfort with unchecked growth, a suspicion of systems that demand constant expansion, a reverence for balance framed as morality or spirituality. These intuitions persist because they are adaptive, even when their origins are forgotten. In moments of modern confidence, these intuitions resurface as unease, as questions about sustainability, resilience, and limits. They are often dismissed as pessimism, yet they may represent inherited awareness, compressed into feeling rather than argument. The silence left by earlier civilizations is not a void, it is a contour. It outlines where thresholds were crossed without recognition. It marks the absence of stories that could not be told because the language to describe structural limits did not yet exist. Understanding this does not require belief in a single lost golden age. It requires attention to process, to the ways civilizations succeed themselves into vulnerability, to the moments when adaptation gives way to preservation, and preservation becomes rigidity. As this realization settles, the inquiry shifts again, away from asking what ended earlier civilizations, and toward recognizing how endings form long before they are named, how limits are encountered gradually, quietly, and often invisibly. The past offers no guarantees, it offers patterns that do not insist on repetition, but invite recognition. They suggest that survival depends not on avoiding thresholds, but on noticing when they approach, and on maintaining enough flexibility to respond when familiar ground gives way. In this light, the earlier worlds have not failed us. They have outlined the edges of possibility. Their silence traces the shape of constraints that remain, waiting to be felt again by those who move forward without realizing how narrow the path has become. As the inquiry nears its later stages, the tone shifts again, not toward resolution, but toward recognition. By now, the idea of earlier civilizations no longer feels speculative or dramatic. It feels structural. What remains to explore is how awareness of limits once sensed becomes integrated or ignored within a living society. This is the moment where patterns confront choice, even if that choice is rarely acknowledged as such. Civilizations do not fail for lack of warning. They fail because warnings arrive in forms that are difficult to translate into action. Signals appear fragmented. One sector experiences strain while another prospers. One region adapts while another resists. The overall picture remains ambiguous. In ambiguity, commitment falters. Earlier civilizations may have lived through extended periods where evidence pointed in multiple directions at once. Some indicators suggested resilience, others suggested decline. Decisions made under such conditions are cautious by necessity. Radical change feels unjustified. Preservation feels responsible. In hindsight, this caution appears like denial. In the moment, it feels like balance. This tension reveals a deeper challenge. Awareness does not scale easily. Individuals may sense fragility long before institutions can respond. Local communities may adapt successfully, while centralized systems lag behind. Insight does not automatically translate into influence. Knowing something is different from being able to act on it. As systems grow, this gap widens. Complexity creates distance between observation and response. By the time information reaches decision-makers, it is filtered, averaged, softened. Urgency dissipates. What remains is a diluted signal, insufficient to justify disruption of established order. Earlier civilizations may have experienced this repeatedly. Innovations emerged at the margins, alternative practices developed quietly. Adaptive responses appeared in pockets. Yet without integration, these responses remained isolated. The center continued as before, unaware that its assumptions were being eroded from the edges. This fragmentation of awareness is not accidental. Large systems reward consistency. They penalize divergence. Practices that work locally but challenge centralized models are tolerated only if they do not threaten coherence. Over time, this creates a false sense of stability. The system appears unified because differences are contained, not because they are resolved. As environmental or social pressures intensify, this containment becomes harder to maintain. Local adaptations spread. Exceptions multiply. The rules bend unevenly. Authority responds by tightening standards, attempting to restore uniformity. This response feels logical, but it often accelerates divergence by ignoring context. At this stage, civilizations begin to experience what might be called temporal lag. Their models describe a world that is already fading. Their responses are calibrated to conditions that no longer exist. Each adjustment arrives slightly too late. The gap between reality and representation widens. The danger of temporal lag is not collapse itself, but misallocation of effort. Resources are spent reinforcing structures that no longer serve. Energy is devoted to preserving appearances rather than addressing underlying shifts. The civilization expends its remaining flexibility on maintenance instead of transformation. Earlier civilizations may have crossed this point unknowingly. Their records suggest periods of intense building, codification, and ritualization just before decline. These activities are often interpreted as excess or decadence. They may instead represent attempts to freeze a world that was already moving away. Freezing is an understandable impulse. It promises certainty. It preserves identity. It reassures continuity. Yet it is incompatible with change. When the environment continues to shift, frozen systems crack rather than bend. What follows is not sudden collapse but disorientation. The civilization still functions, but its actions feel increasingly disconnected from outcomes. Effort increases while effectiveness declines. Trust erodes as promises fail. People withdraw into smaller, more responsive units. Complexity drains from the center. This draining is rarely recognized as progress. It feels like loss. From the perspective of those experiencing it, the world is shrinking. Ambition narrows. Horizons shorten. The future becomes immediate. This contraction is adaptive, but it marks the end of a certain way of life. Later generations inherit this contraction without context. To them, the earlier scale appears unrealistic or mythical. The idea that their ancestors coordinated vast systems seems implausible. The ruins feel excessive, even alien. Memory reframes the past to fit the present. In this reframing, the earlier civilization becomes a story rather than a process. Its ending becomes a lesson rather than an experience. The long struggle to adapt under shifting conditions disappears. What remains is a simplified arc that conceals how awareness failed to converge. This concealment allows the pattern to repeat. New civilizations rise, rediscover scale, coordination, and efficiency. They encounter early thresholds and adapt smoothly. Confidence grows, the memory of temporal lag fades, the cycle resumes. The idea that humanity may be the seventh civilization does not depend on counting discrete empires. It reflects recognition of repeated structural challenges. Each iteration brings new tools and new blind spots. Each negotiates awareness, authority, and adaptation differently. None escape limits entirely. What distinguishes later stages of a civilization is not ignorance of risk, but saturation of attention. Too many signals compete, too many priorities conflict. The system becomes overwhelmed by its own complexity. In this environment, even clear warnings struggle to stand out. Earlier civilizations may have sensed this overwhelm as spiritual crisis or moral decay. Their language lacked terms for systemic overload. They described symptoms, not mechanisms. Their metaphors point toward exhaustion rather than destruction. This exhaustion leaves a particular kind of silence, not the silence of absence, but of overuse. Words lose precision, symbols multiply, meaning diffuses. The civilization speaks more, but says less. In this noise, the quiet truth of misalignment is easily missed. As the inquiry moves forward, this silence becomes instructive. It suggests that the most dangerous moments are not those of ignorance, but those of saturation. When information exceeds capacity, when awareness fragments instead of aligning, when effort replaces understanding. The earlier worlds may not have lacked insight, they may have lacked integration. Their endings were not caused by one mistake, but by many small misalignments accumulating beyond repair. Recognizing this does not offer certainty. It offers orientation. It shifts attention away from dramatic threats and toward subtle drifts, toward moments when the system continues to function, but meaning begins to thin. In that thinning, the past whispers again, not in warning, but in pattern. A reminder that civilizations do not fail when they stop knowing, but when they stop coordinating what they know, when insight remains isolated, when adaptation does not scale. The silence left behind by earlier worlds traces this failure to converge. It marks the space where awareness existed but could not become action, and in that space the story continues, unfinished, waiting for recognition rather than conclusion. As the thread stretches closer to the present, the distance between earlier civilizations and our own begins to feel less like a gap and more like a mirror. What once seemed abstract now carries a familiar weight. The mechanisms described in earlier worlds, fragmented awareness, rigid systems, delayed adaptation, do not belong solely to the deep past. They echo softly in patterns that feel uncomfortably current, not as predictions, but as resonances. At this stage, the inquiry turns toward reflection rather than reconstruction. The question is no longer how many civilizations may have come before, but why each, in its own way, struggled to recognize itself while it still had time. The answer does not rest in ignorance, it rests in momentum. Momentum is subtle. It is the feeling that movement itself is proof of direction. When a civilization is expanding, technologically, territorially, intellectually, it develops confidence in motion. Progress becomes synonymous with continuation. Slowing feels like regression. Pausing feels dangerous. In this atmosphere, questioning the trajectory itself feels disloyal. Earlier civilizations may have been carried by this same force. Their achievements reinforced belief in the path they were on. Success validated structure. Structure validated authority. Authority validated further expansion. The loop closed neatly, leaving little room for external recalibration. What complicates this dynamic is that momentum rewards short-term coherence over long-term resilience. Systems optimized for speed and scale outperform cautious alternatives until conditions change. When they do, momentum becomes inertia. Direction persists even as relevance fades. This transformation is rarely recognized in real time. Momentum feels neutral, even virtuous. It is only in retrospect that it appears misaligned. Earlier civilizations may have sensed unease during periods of peak confidence, but lacked a language to distinguish healthy continuity from blind persistence. The human mind contributes to this difficulty. Pattern recognition favours consistency. Deviations are treated as noise unless they repeat often enough to force attention. In complex systems, repetition can take time. By the time a pattern is undeniable, response options may already be constrained. In earlier worlds, this lag likely manifested as cycles of reform that arrived too late. Attempts to adjust taxation, reorganize labour, codify belief, or strengthen control. Each reform addressed symptoms rather than direction. The deeper question, whether the system itself still matched reality, remained unasked or unanswerable. This is not failure of intelligence, it is a limitation of perspective. Civilizations cannot easily step outside themselves. Their identities are bound to their structures. To question the structure feels like questioning existence itself. As stress accumulated, earlier civilizations may have doubled down on what they knew best. Production intensified, coordination tightened, symbolic order was reinforced. These actions extended functionality, but at the cost of flexibility. The system became louder, more visible, more insistent, yet less capable of change. This insistence often appears in history as obsession with legacy. Monumental building, codification of law, formalization of doctrine. These acts are interpreted as confidence or decadence. They may also represent anxiety, an attempt to anchor meaning as the ground beneath it shifts. Legacy building is not inherently flawed. It preserves memory, it offers continuity. But when legacy replaces learning, the future becomes a replica of the past rather than a response to the present. Earlier civilizations may have reached this pivot without naming it. When collapse eventually unfolded, it did not feel like failure to those within it. It felt like transition. Life reorganized at smaller scales. Authority diffused. Ambition narrowed. The grand narrative dissolved into local stories. From the inside, this was survival. From the outside, it appears as disappearance. Later generations encountered the remnants of these transitions without the context of momentum that produced them. They saw outcomes, not processes. The ruins seemed abrupt. The silences felt mysterious. The long slide of misalignment vanished from memory. This erasure creates a dangerous illusion that collapse comes suddenly, without warning. In reality, warning may be constant but indistinct. It arrives as unease, inefficiency, exhaustion, contradiction. It speaks softly and repeatedly. Momentum drowns it out. As the inquiry continues, this insight sharpens. Earlier civilizations may not have failed to see danger. They may have failed to distinguish danger from the background noise of complexity. When everything demands attention, nothing feels urgent enough to stop motion. The modern resonance of this pattern is difficult to ignore. Systems grow faster than comprehension. Information multiplies faster than integration. Solutions are proposed faster than they can be evaluated. Momentum is celebrated as innovation. Pausing feels irresponsible. Yet the past suggests that pause is not weakness, it is recalibration. It allows perception to catch up with motion. It creates space for alternative futures to be imagined before they are needed. Earlier civilizations may have lacked this space. Their momentum carried them across thresholds before they could name them. By the time friction became undeniable, reversal felt impossible. The cost of stopping outweighed the cost of continuing, even as continuation led toward simplification. This dynamic reframes the idea of collapse once more. It is not a punishment for error. It is a consequence of unexamined motion. Systems do not break because they are evil or foolish, but because they persist beyond the conditions that shaped them. The silence left behind by earlier worlds may reflect this persistence. They did not leave final warnings because there was no final moment. The ending stretched across generations, diffused into daily life, normalized through adaptation. What remains is not instruction, but implication. A suggestion that awareness must sometimes interrupt momentum. That resilience requires not only movement, but reflection. That the ability to stop, reassess, and redirect may be as important as the ability to build. As this part of the journey closes, the question shifts again. Not toward catastrophe or control, but toward choice. Not the dramatic choice of survival versus extinction, but the quieter choice of attention versus acceleration. The earlier civilizations may not have been defeated by nature or fate alone. They may have been carried forward by their own success, beyond the range where that success could protect them. Their silence does not condemn motion. It contextualizes it. It asks gently whether movement is being guided by understanding or merely sustained by habit. And in that question, the past leans closer, not to warn, but to wait, leaving open the possibility that recognition, even late, might still alter the rhythm that has repeated so many times before. As the journey approaches its final stretch, the story of earlier civilizations no longer feels distant or abstract. It settles into something quieter and more intimate, a recognition that endings are rarely abrupt, and that what fades first is not structure, but meaning. Long before walls crumble or systems dissolve, a civilization often loses clarity about why it continues in the form it does. At advanced stages of development, societies become highly skilled at sustaining themselves. They manage resources, regulate behavior, preserve knowledge, and project continuity across generations. These abilities are signs of success, yet they also create a subtle inversion. Survival becomes the primary goal, rather than a consequence of purpose. The civilization continues because it must, not because it knows where it is going. Earlier civilizations may have reached this state without noticing the shift. Their institutions functioned, their rituals persisted, their economies moved. From the outside, everything appeared stable. From within, something felt increasingly rehearsed. The language of values remained, but it was repeated more than lived. Meaning became procedural. This procedural quality alters how people relate to the future. Planning continues, but imagination narrows. The future is expected to resemble the present, refined rather than transformed. Radical alternatives feel irresponsible. Stability is treated as virtue. Preservation becomes morality. Such a mindset does not arise from fear alone, it grows from investment. The more effort poured into building systems, the harder it becomes to question them. Identity becomes intertwined with structure. To imagine a different form of life feels like betrayal, not only of ancestors, but of oneself. Earlier civilizations may have felt this tension as a quiet fatigue. Not physical exhaustion, but conceptual weariness. The sense that solutions increasingly address symptoms rather than causes. That effort intensified while satisfaction declined. That motion continued, yet direction blurred. This fatigue rarely surfaces in official records. Public narratives emphasize continuity and strength. Doubt retreats into private spaces, art, philosophy, personal reflection. These expressions are often dismissed later as decadence or decline. They may instead reflect early awareness that something essential was thinning. When meaning thins, participation changes. People still comply, but less wholeheartedly. Loyalty becomes conditional. Engagement becomes transactional. The system still functions, but it requires more enforcement, more incentive, more explanation. Trust erodes quietly. Earlier civilizations may have responded by tightening order. Rules multiplied, authority consolidated, symbols of unity grew more prominent. These measures restored surface stability, but they also deepened dependence on control. The system became heavier, less responsive, more expensive to maintain. At this stage, collapse does not need to arrive as disaster. The civilization has already lost elasticity. When disruption appears, whether environmental, social, or internal, the response is slow and rigid. Adjustments amplify strain instead of relieving it. The system reacts against itself. What follows is not immediate disappearance, but contraction. Scale reduces, complexity sheds layers, institutions fragment. Life reorganizes around what can be sustained without constant intervention. To those living through it, this feels like adaptation. To later observers, it appears as decline. Later generations inherit the outcome without the context. They see ruins without sensing fatigue. They encounter artifacts without understanding obligation. The earlier world appears excessive, even irrational. Its disappearance seems sudden because the long process of internal hollowing left few traces. This misinterpretation shapes how history is told. Civilizations are remembered as having fallen due to one cause: war, climate, invasion, moral decay. These explanations are tidy. They overlook the quieter truth, that systems often persist beyond the point where they can renew meaning. If humanity is indeed one chapter in a longer sequence, then the significance lies not in counting how many civilizations came before, but in recognizing shared moments of narrowing. Moments when continuation eclipsed reflection, when success discouraged reconsideration, when momentum replaced choice. Earlier civilizations may have sensed this narrowing but lacked the tools to name it. Their language framed it as destiny, divine will, or cyclical time. These metaphors point toward experience, not ignorance. They reflect an awareness that something larger than individual choice was shaping outcomes. Today, the language is different. We speak of systems, incentives, sustainability, resilience, yet the underlying tension remains familiar. Growth brings pressure, scale brings fragility, success brings blind spots. None of this implies inevitable collapse. It implies responsibility. Responsibility, however, is difficult to exercise collectively. It demands coordination not just of action, but of meaning. It requires societies to ask not only how to continue, but whether continuation in its current form still serves life. Earlier civilizations may have delayed this question, until delay itself became irreversible. Their silence reflects that postponement. It records not a lack of intelligence, but the weight of attachment. Letting go is harder than building. As this reflection deepens, the idea of collapse transforms once more. It no longer appears as failure, but as release, sometimes forced, sometimes gentle. A return to scales of life that can be supported without constant strain. The tragedy is not simplification itself, but the suffering created by rigidity beforehand. What remains unresolved is whether recognition can soften this transition, whether noticing narrowing early enough can allow deliberate release rather than sudden loss, whether complexity can be reshaped instead of shed. The past does not answer these questions directly. It offers atmosphere rather than instruction, a sense that this moment, this mixture of capability and unease, has been felt before, that civilizations often stand longest at the edge of recognition, continuing because stopping feels impossible. Earlier worlds did not end because they were wrong. They ended because they became too fixed to respond fluidly to change. Their silence marks the point where flexibility gave way to preservation. In recognizing this, the inquiry arrives at a fragile pause, not an ending, but a space where awareness can still intervene, where habit can be examined, where momentum can be questioned without panic. The rhythm remains visible: rise, consolidation, narrowing, release. What differs is how consciously the release occurs, whether it is resisted until it fractures, or guided until it transforms. As this part closes, the story no longer presses toward conclusion. It settles into uncertainty, where choice still flickers. The earlier civilizations may not have escaped this rhythm, but they have outlined it clearly enough to be felt. Their silence does not demand fear. It invites attentiveness, a willingness to sense when meaning thins beneath continuity. When success begins to weigh more than it lifts. When the future asks not for more momentum but for space. And in that space, something rare remains possible. Not certainty, not permanence, but a gentler alignment with change itself. At the end of this long listening, the question that remains is no longer urgent in the way questions usually are. It does not ask for proof or dates or names. It lingers instead, like a low tone beneath everything else. A recognition that civilizations do not end so much as they pass through states of attention. What changes is not only what they build, but how carefully they listen to the conditions that allow building to matter. If humanity is the seventh civilization, then the number itself is less important than the spacing between them. The pauses, the intervals where complexity loosened its grip and life reorganized around simpler truths. These intervals are not empty. They are dense with adaptation, memory compressed into instinct, and stories shaped to survive forgetting. They are where the past exhales before the next breath begins. Earlier civilizations may have reached moments when the future grew too heavy to carry forward in its existing form, not because it lacked promise, but because promise had hardened into obligation. In those moments, release was inevitable. What differed was whether release arrived gently, through conscious simplification, or violently, through systems breaking under their own weight. The silence that follows these releases has often been misunderstood. It is not the silence of annihilation, it is the silence of reorientation, a turning away from abstraction toward immediacy, from vast coordination toward local coherence, from ambition toward balance. Life does not disappear in these spaces, it changes tempo. When later societies look back across these silences, they see absence where there was adjustment. They imagine catastrophe where there was shedding. They search for villains where there were thresholds. This misreading is understandable. It is easier to narrate endings than transitions. Endings feel decisive. Transitions feel unfinished. Yet the unfinished quality may be the most honest inheritance. The story of civilization does not conclude. It modulates. It shifts key. Each phase carries forward traces of the last. Warning softened into morals, knowledge dissolved into ritual, memory folded into behavior. Nothing is lost entirely. Nothing is preserved intact. If earlier civilizations left behind anything resembling guidance, it is not instruction, but rhythm. A pattern that repeats not because it must, but because it emerges naturally from how humans relate to time, scale, and meaning. Build, optimize, consolidate, strain, simplify, rest, begin again. The rhythm does not condemn, it describes. What makes the present moment feel different is not that the rhythm has changed, but that awareness of it has sharpened. The echoes are easier to hear. The patterns feel closer to the surface. Not because history is accelerating toward a conclusion, but because attention has widened. The past has become legible in ways it was not before. This legibility does not grant immunity. Recognition does not cancel gravity, but it does alter posture. It invites humility rather than triumph, curiosity rather than certainty. It suggests that endurance may depend less on extending complexity and more on cultivating flexibility, on knowing when to loosen structures before they fracture. The earlier worlds may not have lacked this intuition. Their myths and philosophies often circle it without naming it directly. They speak of balance, cycles, renewal, and return. These are not mystical evasions. They are attempts to articulate limits in languages that could survive across generations. What was harder to preserve was agency, the ability to act on recognition collectively. Insight tends to arise unevenly. Systems tend to resist it. Between the two lies the quiet tragedy of delay, not because people did not care, but because coordination of change is harder than coordination of continuity. As this journey closes, the idea of civilization itself feels less like a monument and more like a tide. It advances, recedes, reshapes the shoreline, and leaves patterns in the sand that resemble intention even when no one remains to claim them. The shoreline is never the same, but the movement is familiar. If there is a warning embedded here, it is gentle. It does not shout. It does not predict. It simply suggests that attention matters, that meaning must be renewed, not merely preserved, that systems require room to breathe, that success, left unexamined, can quietly become its own constraint. The earlier civilizations may have reached the edge of this realization too late to act decisively. Or perhaps they acted in ways we do not recognize because our definitions of success differ from theirs. Their silence leaves that question open. What remains with us now is not an ending, but a threshold, a space where momentum can be felt without being obeyed automatically, where narrowing can be noticed before it hardens, where release, if it comes, might arrive with less violence and more intention. This does not promise continuity. Nothing does. It offers something quieter, alignment, a way of moving that accepts impermanence without surrendering care, a posture that values adaptability over scale, coherence over control, and listening over acceleration. In this light, the civilizations before us do not appear as failures or warnings carved in stone. They appear as earlier attempts to live with forces larger than comprehension, using the tools available at the time. Their endings were not mistakes. They were transitions shaped by limits that remain relevant. The story does not conclude with certainty. It settles into awareness, a sense that the past is not behind us but beneath us, supporting, cautioning, and reminding without speaking directly. Its lessons are not commands. They are invitations to notice, And so, as the listening draws to a close, nothing is resolved. The question remains open, suspended between breath and breath, not asking what ended the first civilizations, but what allows any civilization to remain awake to itself while it still has time to change shape. The night grows quiet here, not empty but receptive, a place where the long rhythm continues and where the next movement has not yet chosen its form.